Due to the content of this presentation, parental guidance is recommended to 16 years. On June 18, 1982, a man was found hanging from London's Blackfriars Bridge, in what was first thought to be a personal tragedy. But when the real identity of the man was established, many questions started to emerge. Because he was none other than Roberto Calvi, the head of the shady Vatican Bank with the slightly creepy name, the Institute for Works of Religion. He was also president of the Milan-based Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks that collapsed earlier that year. But how did the 62-year-old Roberto Calvi, nicknamed God's banker, get to the scaffolding on the bridge by himself? He would have had to climb down the bridge from a ladder, jump a distance between the ladder and the scaffolding, while weighted down by 5 kilos of bricks. And as many wondered at the time, why bother to go all the way to London to when there are many bridges in Rome? Its tentacles reach back to the sudden death of Pope John Paul I, who died after only 33 days as Pope in 1978, a death that along with Calvi's murder, was later portrayed in The Godfather Part 3. The mystery of what really happened to Calvi would last for decades and involve not only the Vatican but also the Italian and American mafia, intelligence services, and the Masons. This is the strange deaths of Pope John Paul I and Roberto Calvi, God's banker.
Questa è la storia del Vaticano con Magnus.
If you can afford it, please consider supporting the channel through Patreon or buy me a coffee. It would really help a lot. There's a link in the description below. According to Gerald Posner and his book, God's Bankers, the Vatican was the true rulers of Europe and its colonies abroad for almost 2 millennia. They taxed people and sold indulgences, which is a piece of paper, absolving you from your sins, something that would later spark the Reformation. But this wasn't enough to cover the church's expenses and they had to borrow money from the Jewish super-rich Rothschild banking family. This was very upsetting for many Christians and cardinals, because lending money from the people that they viewed was the killer of Jesus, was not seen favorably. In 1870 the Vatican lost all its territories and its empire when Italy was unified to one country, leaving the church with only a small land area in Rome. In 1929 the papacy struck a deal with the devil. Fascist dictator Benito Mussolini made the Vatican a small sovereign state with the Pope as the head of state, and in return for all their lost lands, the church received a payment of $90 million, and was given tax-free property rights, and guaranteed salaries for all priests throughout the country from the Italian government. This is important because now the church suddenly had a lot of money they could spend. Before this, the church's valuables were all tied up in art, property and other things. Now the Vatican had money to move into profitable businesses. A few years later the Vatican struck another deal with the devil, where the church acknowledged Hitler's power in Germany, and Hitler acknowledged the papacy. During the Second World War, Pope Pius XII formed the Vatican Bank. The reason for this was that the Allies were trying to stop anyone trading with the enemy. The Vatican Bank claimed they were neutral and supported Hitler and Nazi Germany and helped their economic situation. The Vatican Bank, with the help of the British and the Americans, later helped some Nazis to escape to South America. The Vatican, the bank and intelligence agencies had become partners at the end of the war. During the 1960s the Vatican Bank increased its financial speculations and risk-taking and now had seriously changed course from its humble beginnings, when it had only priests and devout Catholics as customers.
Since 1945, especially in the 50s and the early 60s, the Vatican did expand terrifically. There was an expansion there of participation in the creation of money, which is unparalleled in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And it consisted of very careful investment of monies originally received from the previous government, the pre-war government, plus windfalls of one kind or another coming out of the war, And they created an association of trusted men, uomini di fiducia. It's a Vatican phrase, uomo di fiducia, somebody you can trust, who sits on the board of a bank in Lugano, or sits on the board of a potash factory in Upper Silesia, or on IBM, or wherever, and takes care of Vatican affairs.
Calvi was introduced to the Vatican as a uomo di fiducia, a man of trust. President of Ambrosiano, a good Catholic banker, absolutely discreet. He was soon a regular visitor.
In 1978, the Bank of Italy produced a report on Banco Ambrosiano which found that several billion lire had been exported illegally, leading to criminal investigations. The Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, and at the center of the bank's failure were its chairman, Roberto Calvi, and his membership in the illegal former Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due. The Vatican Bank was Banco Ambrosiano's main shareholder, and was also accused of funneling covert United States funds to the Polish trade union Solidarity and to the Nicaraguan Contras through the bank. Roberto Calvi had joined the Banco Ambrosiano as a clerk at just 27, and had quickly climbed his way to become one of the leaders in the bank. In 1975 he had led the bank to acquire Swiss bank Banca del Gottardo and founded several offshore companies.
Now, we'll look at the worldwide financial structure Calvi set up. Listen carefully. He deliberately made this complicated. From the home bank in Milan, he set up a financial company in Luxembourg called Banco Ambrosiano Holdings. This allowed him to move money outside Italian laws. From Luxembourg, he established a bank in Switzerland, the Bank of Gottardo. He then expanded operations across the Atlantic to the Bahamas, Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited, then to Nicaragua, Banco Comercial, to Peru, Banco Andino, and at his death he had just completed a multi-million-dollar building in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In the midst of all of this, he went to Panama and set up a dozen shell or paper companies with names like Manic Incorporated, Bellatrix, Worldwide Trading. They were at the heart of Calvi's scheme. We'll see how in a minute. They were essentially mailboxes. One of their directors was really the switchboard operator at Calvi's bank in Nassau, the Bahamas.
The bank even helped the Italian and American mafia to move and launder drug money. But don't worry, it was all in God's name.
Hallelujah!
Calvi was a friend of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank and one of the main characters behind all the shady dealings. I will come back to Marcinkus later in this presentation.
Calvi arranged huge loans to his Panamanian companies, several $100 million at a time, from his banks in Luxembourg, Milan, Nassau, and Lima. When the loans came due, Calvi stalled repayment with what are called letters of patronage, like a banker's character reference. They said the Panamanian companies were creditworthy, and it worked, because the letters were signed by Paul Marcinkus. Calvi was seen to have a Vatican blessing. Now, for the banks involved, it proved to be a very mixed blessing indeed. For Marcinkus got from Calvi in return a secret written agreement that the Vatican would bear no responsibility for the loans, a position the Vatican maintains today. How much is involved? Altogether, $1.4 billion.
The missing money turned out to have been lent to 10 shadow companies controlled by the Vatican Bank. They had gotten the loans to do this without having to put up any collateral or security for the loans, because after all, the Vatican Bank was the Bank of God. In 1978, the Bank of Italy produced a report on Banco Ambrosiano which found that several billion lire had been exported illegally, leading to criminal investigations. In August the same year, Pope Paul IV died of a heart attack. After many scandals during his papacy, among them his fascist background, the cardinals elected a very different kind of pope in John Paul I. He had a humble background, came from a poor family, unlike most of his fellow cardinals. The new pope was rumored to plan a house cleaning after all the scandals that had rocked the Vatican and the papacy, and was going to set up an investigation into what had happened. This was something that would have seriously shaken up the power structure in the Vatican, with many powerful people risking, not only being exposed as fraudulent, but maybe even prosecuted for their crimes, something that unsurprisingly scared the holy shit out of the power elite there. But this of course never happened, because after only 33 days as Pope, and without any known health issues, the new Pope suddenly died. His short reign as well as contradictory reports about the circumstances, sparked several conspiracy theories surrounding his sudden death. There were several figures who have come under suspicion, each for different reasons. Cardinal Sebastiano Baggio was head of the Vatican's prefect of the Congregation for Bishops during the 1970s, giving him significant power when selecting new bishops. According to priest and author Charles Murr, Baggio was also a Freemason who had worked for years to see that liberal bishops were appointed. According to Murr, John Paul I had been warned about Baggio and removed him from the congregation shortly after becoming Pope, and Baggio was also the last person to see the Pope alive. David Yallop have written several books about the scandal and proposed that the Pope had been in potential danger because of the corruption in the Vatican Bank. He writes that the Pope had been given a list of 121 Masons, and on September 28, the day of his death, that the three archbishops, Marcinkus, Villot and Cody, conspired with three mafia-connected people, Calvi, Sindona and Gelli, in the murder of John Paul I. He writes, "It was clear that these 6 men had a great deal to fear if the papacy of John Paul I should continue. All of them stood to gain in a variety of ways if John Paul I should suddenly die." The theologian Abbé Georges de Nantes spent much of his life building a case for murder against the Vatican, collecting statements from people who knew the Pope before and after his election. His writings also talk about and go into detail about the banks and how Pope John Paul I's supposed discovery of a number of Freemason priests in the Vatican, along with a number of his proposed reforms, and in this way, threatening the old power structure in the Vatican. In his book, When the Bullet Hits the Bone, Anthony Raimondi, who claims to be a nephew of Lucky Luciano, says that he helped his cousin Archbishop Paul Marcinkus kill the Pope by putting Valium in his tea to knock him out, then poisoning him with cyanide. The reason given was that John Paul had allegedly threatened to expose a massive stock fraud run by Vatican insiders. Raimondi says that plans were made to also assassinate John Paul II had the latter decided to expose the fraud. Raimondi says that, if they take the Pope's body and do any type of testing, they will still find traces of the poison in his system. Baron Avro Manhattan linked the CIA to the murder of the Pope, writing, "The suspected CIA covert agent, the Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal John Cody, visited the Polish cardinal, later to become John Paul II, in Krakow during the papacy of John Paul I. What they talked about no one knows, but the new Pope would not touch anyone in the power structure in the Vatican during his papacy." There are also problems with the story the Vatican has told us, because they said that John Paul I died of a heart attack, but an autopsy was never performed, so how could the Vatican be sure the Pope had died from a heart attack? They also said that the Pope was found sitting up in bed, still holding his reading material, with his signature warm smile. This made many question whether that a peaceful pose matches the description of a man who had just suffered a massive heart attack. The Pope's body was embalmed immediately upon being discovered, which goes against both Vatican protocol and Italian law. This prompted suspicions that officials were trying to cover up potential evidence of poisoning in the blood. They also lied when they first announced that a papal secretary had found John Paul's body, before later admitting that it was in fact a nun who had come in to serve the Pope's morning coffee. The original story of a man finding the Pope was, according to the Vatican, altered to avoid the potential scandal of the presence of a woman in the Pope's bedroom, which along with the other explanations make it difficult to believe the Vatican's version of what happened to the 33-day Pope.
Hold on to your butt.
Because you're not going to believe this next guy's story, but I swear it's all true. And I have not included everything, because that would be a very long presentation. This guy is a whole video in himself. Licio Gelli was an active fascist during the rule of dictator Benito Mussolini, and was later appointed liaison between Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. There he got close relations with Hermann Göring, and became a member of the SS Hermann Göring division within the Schutzstaffel. After the Second World War, Gelli was acquitted of participation in executions of partisans committed by the SS, and he escaped the war settlement by cooperating with Italian intelligence, MI5 and the CIA. Gelli also made good money running a travel agency for war criminals who wanted to flee to Latin America. A number of Nazis escaped the Nuremberg trials by fleeing to South America via Switzerland under the code name Operation Paperclip, and Gelli was a willing helper, along with the British and the Americans. Later, with the help of the same intelligence services as before, Gelli fled to Argentina. There he allied himself with dictator Juan Perón, became Perón's economic advisor on Italy, and was granted dual citizenship. He later returned to Italy, where he became involved with the Vatican and Roberto Calvi.
The man's real name is Vizio Gelli, a former Italian fascist who had dodged arrest for 18 months. Gelli was also the Grand Master of an illegal, ultra-secret political society of Italian Freemasons. In the 1970s, he inducted almost 1,000 of Italy's most powerful men in clandestine rituals here, in Rome's Excelsior Hotel. Gelli created an organization of the radical right, a state within a state, taking in government ministers, generals, heads of corporations, and major banks, like Calvi, even the head of the Italian Secret Services. They called themselves Propaganda 2, P2, and when they were uncovered in March of 1981, the scandal brought down the Italian government.
It was written that P2 was aiming to a coup d'etat here in Italy. I don't think it's true. They already did the coup d'etat because the P2 members, or brothers, as they used to be called, they occupied the most important ranks and places in the Italian administration. I mean, in the army, in the navy, in the secret services, in the state-owned oil and iron groups. I mean, in 2 or 3 banks, in the newspapers, in the magistrates. I mean, they didn't need any violent or bloody coup. They already got it in a very smooth and silent but effective way.
In 1981, the Italian Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani and his coalition was forced to resign, following a police raid on the home of Lucio Gelli, that uncovered a list of hundreds of members of the P2 Masonic Lodge, where Gelli was the Grand Master. A whopping 962 names were on the list, including 44 members of the Italian Parliament, 3 of whom were cabinet ministers, 49 bankers, numerous industrialists, a number of newspaper editors and other high-profile journalists, the heads of all 3 of Italy's secret services and more than 200 military and police officers, including 12 generals of the Carabinieri and 5 of the Guardia di Finanza. When the scandal hit the Italian news, he fled to Switzerland, where he was arrested while trying to withdraw tens of millions of dollars from a special bank account in Geneva. He was later found guilty of fraud from the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano. However, he escaped from Swiss prison and went to live in hiding in South America until 1987, when he gave himself up and was extradited to Italy. In 1998 he fled again, this time from his home in Tuscany while on parole, but Italian police tracked him down to Cannes, on the French Riviera. He was extradited a second time to begin a 12-year prison sentence in Italy. He died at age 96. Pope Paul VI appointed Archbishop Paul Marcinkus as the president of the Vatican Bank in 1971, even though he had no prior experience as a banker. Marcinkus was for decades one of the highest-ranking people in the Vatican, serving Popes John XIII, Paul VI and John Paul II, and was the president of the Vatican Bank and its shady dealings for more than 20 years. The Archbishop was living an extravagant lifestyle, in an expensive apartment in one of Rome's most posh neighborhoods, collecting art, eating daily at Michelin restaurants, playing golf and acting more like a playboy than a man of the Holy Church. As early as 1973, Marcinkus had been questioned by United States federal prosecutors about his involvement in the delivery of $14.5 million worth of counterfeit bonds to the Vatican in July 1971. His name had popped up in a letter that came to light during the investigation of an international gangster, who eventually served 12 years in prison, but the Archbishop was never charged. Marcinkus never faced prosecution, because Italy's highest courts ruled that the Vatican Bank as an entity belonging to the Roman Catholic Church was outside the jurisdiction of Italian authorities under the terms of the 1929 Lateran Treaty that the Vatican had made with Benito Mussolini. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus has never spent a day in jail and returned to the Archdiocese of Chicago in 1990, before retiring to Arizona. He has always declined to discuss his role in the Ambrosiano scandal. The investigation revealed that Calvi had used a complex network of overseas banks and companies to move money out of Italy, to inflate share prices, and to secure massive unsecured loans. The controversy surrounding Calvi's dealings at Banco Ambrosiano echoed a scandal in 1974, when the Holy See lost an estimated $30 million upon the collapse of the Franklin National Bank, owned by financier Michel Sindona. Sindona died in prison after drinking coffee laced with cyanide. Whether he was poisoned or took is unknown. Calvi was tried in 1981, given a 4-year suspended sentence, and fined $19.8 million. He appealed the verdict and was released on bail. Calvi now tried desperately to appeal directly to Pope John Paul II. In a letter, the banker told the Pope that he was his last hope to avoid the bank's crash, and the damages the Vatican would suffer as a consequence. At the end of the letter, Calvi added, "I won't be blackmailed, and I won't blackmail in return. I have always been loyal, even when it's most dangerous." The high-ranking Vatican Cardinal, José Castillo Lara, later said the Pope never received Calvi's letter. Sure, such an important letter probably just got lost in transit. Now realizing he has been thrown to the vultures, Roberto Calvi refuses to be the scapegoat, and he loads a briefcase full of what is believed to be incriminating documents, a briefcase that wouldn't leave his side until his death. Calvi had now started using bulletproof cars and hired protection for him and his family. Calvi's driver and bodyguard was Silvano Viter, and he said that Calvi was relaxed and in a good mood when they left on their secret trip from Italy. He got no hints that Calvi was. They ended up in Austria on June 14. Here Calvi met Flavio Carboni, a millionaire developer, and Hans Kuhns from Zurich. After the meeting, Calvi changed his plans and got a private plane for him and Viter, but Calvi never said what the two men had told him, in order for him to change his plans. Calvi and Viter flew to London, and here Calvi began acting really paranoid, and told Viter to call every 20 minutes if he went outside, refusing himself to leave the hotel room. Flavio Carboni came to London the day before Calvi's death, and even though he is a multi-millionaire, he doesn't check into a hotel, but stays with a fellow Mason, William Morris, in a poor and anonymous neighborhood, a man he had only met once before. Calvi apparently planned to travel across the Atlantic. His wife had already moved to Washington, and he told his daughter, who was in Switzerland, to do the same. In a phone conversation with his daughter, the day before he died, Calvi told her, "Something really important is happening, and tomorrow all hell is going to break loose." His prediction came true the very next day. On June 17, the bank's board voted to remove the missing Roberto Calvi as president, and dissolve itself, asking Italy's central bank to nominate a commissioner to deal with its affairs. The same day, Calvi's long-term personal secretary, Graziella Carroccia, fell to her death from a window of the bank, in what was quickly ruled. She had reportedly left a note saying, "May Calvi be double cursed for the damage he has caused the bank and all its employees." This supposed many had trouble believing, because Carroccia had a very close relationship with Calvi. She would have known much of what Calvi's dealings was. It's also very unusual for a woman to herself by jumping, leading to the suspicion that someone was cleaning house, and that Graziella Carroccia had been thrown out of the window. Calvi's bodyguard says that Carboni wanted to talk to Calvi the day of his death, but that the latter refused to go down to meet Carboni, and Vitor went down to meet him in the lobby instead. While Vitor was downstairs with Carboni, Calvi disappeared from the hotel room. In between 11:30 and 1 a.m., Calvi left the hotel on his own initiative, was convinced to leave, or was taken, then traveled 6.5 kilometers to Blackfriars Bridge, and put smoldered bricks into his pants before he died. All this, even though he had more than enough in his hotel room to kill. His bodyguard Vitor left London the very next day. The briefcase Calvi had with him has never been found. Carboni would later be charged with and then acquitted of selling the briefcase to a high-ranking IOR official. Detective Trevor Smith, who led the later investigation in London, told The Independent in 2004 that police believed Calvi was strangled on a boat along the Thames, and was then hanged, dead or barely alive from the scaffolding. Both British and Italian authorities concluded it was the mafia that wanted and planned Calvi's death, a theory that was supported in 2012 by a godfather-turned-informant, Francesco "Frankie the Strangler" De Carlo. He said that the reason Calvi was killed was due to the banker's involvement in the criminal organization's money laundering, and the possibility that he may disclose details of the scheme to the authorities. 5 people were charged in 2003 with Calvi's death. Among them were Carboni and Vitor, and Giuseppe Callo, the mafia man nicknamed the Cosa Nostra cashier. They were all acquitted for lack of evidence in 2007, and also acquitted in the second trial that happened a few years later. The court's ruling, however, did confirm that Calvi was killed, but by whom the court could not tell, and instead, all the possible suspects, the Camorra, the Cosa Nostra, P2, Vatican's investment arm, Italian politicians, and Italian Secret Service members, all could have their fingers at play here. When Calvi's bodyguard Vitor was asked why he left Calvi alone for 1.5 hours when he disappeared, his reply was this.
You see, if Mr. Calvi was murdered, it was very convenient that you, the man who was supposed to be looking after him, happened to be out of the room at the time he disappeared in the company of Mr. Carboni.
I can't reply to this question, because whatever answer I give, it would be the wrong one.
I found this presentation interesting, even though there was a lot of information compressed into a short time. And if you can afford it, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, or buy me a coffee. It would really help the channel a lot. There's a link in the description below. And I hope to see you in the next one.